We're proud to support the craft of journalism. UBS brings you the latest news from around the world with The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Be part of an international network that brings together leading insights, research, and technology across 24 time zones and 12 key financial hubs, with you at the center of it all. UBS. Advice is our craft.
You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 18th of August 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up,
there were many points that we agreed on, most of them I would say, a couple of big ones that we haven't quite got there. So there's no deal until there's a deal.
3 days on from the Alaska summit, we'll examine what the rest of the West can do after Vladimir Putin's apparent diplomatic triumph over Donald Trump. But as Volodymyr Zelensky heads to Washington with a team of European leaders in tow, we'll ask what kind of reception will they all get today. Also ahead in the next 60 minutes.
My father's case is crucial for China-UK relations. Even if he gets 5 years, for example, that's practically the same as a death sentence.
We'll hear the latest as the trial of the Hong Kong businessman Jimmy Lai draws to a close amid fears for his health. Plus, why are so many people leaving New Zealand? Clue, it's a draw of better wages elsewhere. We'll find out why it's harder than ever to park your car in the UAE, and we'll have a visitor from outer space in the studio in the shape of a meteorite. That's all ahead on The Globalist, live from London. First, a quick look at what else is happening in the news. Police in Israel have violently broken up a protest outside the headquarters in Tel Aviv of the Prime Minister's Likud party. A court in Australia has fined the national airline Qantas a record $59 million for illegally dismissing 1,800 ground staff during the COVID pandemic. And Canada's national airline has suspended plans to resume flights. The government had ordered cabin crew not to strike over pay, but they are still taking action. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, 2 days after Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin's encounter in Anchorage, Europe is leaving nothing to chance. Not only is the Ukrainian president heading to Washington today, he'll be accompanied by half a dozen European leaders, including France's and Finland's presidents, the German Chancellor, the British and Italian Prime Ministers, and the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, and the NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte has downed tools and will be part of this last-minute group too. Well, in a moment, we'll examine whether this Three Musketeers approach will have the desired effect on Donald Trump. But first, let's look back at Friday. Monocle's Seattle correspondent Gregory Scruggs sent us this report about the Alaska summit.
A volcano erupted Tuesday on Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula, leading to cancelled flights across Alaskan airspace. So it seems more appropriate to say that the ash, rather than the dust, has not fully settled from the other Russian volcanic eruption on Alaskan soil last week. U.S. President Donald Trump's red carpet welcome for Russian president and wanted war criminal Vladimir Putin was a stunning attempt at reputational rehabilitation. 3.5 years ago, Putin was swiftly turning his nation into a pariah state. Western businesses fled in droves, and sanctions rained down like mortar fire. Friday's tiptoe toward rapprochement was potentially welcome news on the West Coast, a region that Putin mentioned by name, as primed to benefit from closer economic ties to Russia's Far East. But this trans-Pacific pitch is unlikely to generate a new gold rush. An Alaskan source who previously did business in Russia told me over the weekend he's in no hurry to return, as corruption and kleptocracy will scare off investors even in peacetime. Putin also highlighted the importance of renewed Arctic cooperation, something Alaskans are keen to resume. There was no small irony in Trump hosting Putin at the same military base where the 11th Airborne Division, nicknamed the Arctic Angels, were reactivated precisely to counter the Russian threat. But peace is the prerequisite for any reintegration of Russia into the global community, however awkward and halting it will be. On that score, Trump made an error by offering an olive branch and a limousine ride too early. He left Anchorage with no ceasefire, and by the next day had dropped that demand entirely in favor of the more Moscow-friendly calls for a full peace agreement. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is now under intense pressure to cede territory as he arrives at the White House today, something forbidden under his country's constitution. Future U.S. military support and security guarantees may be contingent on a land for peace deal, but Kyiv is now less reliant on Washington. Since March, European allies have outspent the U.S. in military aid for the first time since the conflict began. While Friday's tete-a-tete was billed as high stakes, it turned out to be more of a friendly match. The true high-stakes poker game gets underway later today.
That was Gregory Scruggs, Monocle's Seattle correspondent. Now let's hear more from Monocle's Ukrainian expert, Julia Jen, and Ash Bhardwaj, journalist, author and expert on Russia and Ukraine. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Morning.
Julia, let me begin with you. In the studio, as a Ukrainian, how high are the stakes, or how dicey is the situation for Volodymyr Zelensky today as he flies to Washington?
Couldn't be higher. So I think he's actually landed in Washington in the last few minutes. And I think Ukrainians are all going to be thinking about that Oval Office meeting. That's something everyone is talking about, that horrific kind of heart-sinking feeling that many people, not just Ukrainians around the globe, had when they watched that tete-a-tete between Trump and Zelensky. But I think what's going to happen today is I think Zelensky is going to try desperately for Putin... gosh, what a slip of the tongue, for Trump to hear him out, to not kind of blow up, become volcanic, and to really hear about what kind of is happening on Ukraine's front lines, the Ukrainian strengths that they can present to the US, and that this isn't really a country that's asking for money, asking, kind of leeching off the US, but this is a country that can provide serious, security guarantees even for Europe, for the European leaders that are going to be accompanying Zelensky today to Washington.
And just let's stay with this, Julia, for a moment, about these 6 European leaders. One wonders what the image is going to be. I mean, it was an astonishing sight yesterday as leader after leader after leader saying, I'm going. And this sort of last-minute scramble to get behind Zelensky. And one wonders whether this works, which way this is going to work. Either they're all going to crash through the room and Donald Trump will be very annoyed that everybody's come to bully him, or whether he will absolutely adore the pageantry and they work out on the spot who's the one who's going to charm him. I mean, it's a big risk that Europe's taking.
Absolutely. I mean, today, all of it is a gamble, very much for Zelensky, very much for Trump, very much for the European leaders. So firstly, Zelensky and Trump will meet around 6 p.m. London time, so that's 1 p.m. Washington time. They'll meet first, one-on-one, and then the European leaders will come in. And I think very much it will be a kind of feeling of intuition, who can play kind of which sort of tone with him at that moment. So we know Stubb is going, for example, we were just talking, Emma, about his diplomacy via golf. He's really charmed Trump with his golf playing. Starmer, of course, we remember that amazing moment in the White House when he handed that letter from the king directly to Trump, and so on and so forth. And Meloni, of course, another leader that he's very keen on in Europe. So I think they've all got kind of different strengths to play, different things, and they can sort of bounce off each other probably. They'll be be quite coquettish or whatever. In the Oval Office, they'll be really trying to keep the temperature down and potentially smooth over any issues that might have arisen in that meeting with Zelensky and Trump.
Ash, let's bring you in here to talk about this smoothing things over with Zelensky and Trump. This is actually absolutely key to the whole thing, isn't it? Because Putin charms Trump in a way that Zelensky does not.
The relationship between the United States and Ukraine is important, not just because of the weapons that America supplies, that provides capabilities for air defense and for long-range strike, but also intelligence and, of course, the sanctions support against Russia. And we saw earlier on in the year with that awful meeting in the White House that Trump's reaction to that was to eventually see discussions about withdrawing support from Ukraine. There's a temporary pause of weapons support to Ukraine. But as you've already spoken about earlier on today, the way that is done is slightly different now, in that the Europeans are putting most of the money in, but the weapons do still come from the United States originally in the first place. So that relationship does really matter. And I think where Trump gets annoyed with Zelensky is that Zelensky doesn't just do what Trump wants him to do to end the war quickly. By Trump saying Zelensky ending the war quickly, what he means is capitulating and giving in to Russia's demands. And Russia's demands haven't really changed since they started the war in 2022, which is stopping Ukraine from gaining security guarantees through joining NATO and through associations with the European Union, for what the Russians call denazification, which actually just means the removal of the democratically elected government of Volodymyr Zelensky, and the giving to Russia of territory that Ukraine has defended for the last 11 years. So part of the discussions that have been talked about, it's been called a land swap, but what the Russians are still demanding is that Ukraine gives up territory in Donetsk, Kherson and Zaporizhia that Russia has been unable to capture militarily. So for Trump, his frustrations with Zelensky is Zelensky won't give in to this, because that's what leads to the war continuing. The other person, of course, who could stop it would be Vladimir Putin by simply stopping the war.
Julia, this is a very, very big problem for Zelensky, isn't it? Given the fact that, as Ash has just said, Donetsk Russia hasn't been able to capture it, but it's also phenomenally important, not least agriculturally. It's a rich and fertile place. But also, Zelensky's country's constitution prevents him from handing over land. So what options does Zelensky have?
Well, he's already said that, you know, we're not handing over, we're not taking our troops out of the Donetsk region. And actually, there was a really fascinating statistic posted yesterday by Deep State, which is an open source intelligence interactive online map that tracks the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They posted yesterday that less than 1% of Ukraine's territory has actually been taken by Russia since November 2022. So I'm sure that Zelensky's going to be presenting facts like this, and also Ukraine's recent gains on the front line, in the last 24 hours, where they've beaten off the Russians, to show, look, we're not like a weak partner in this, or even a weak sort of weak partner in this. We are people who can bring strength to this kind of conversation. Yeah, it's completely, Ukrainians all very much sympathise, and there have been lots of criticisms of Zelensky in the past few weeks because of the protesting around the country, etc. But Ukrainians all very much online and in conversations have been very much sympathising with Zelensky. He's faced with this devil's choice. What does he actually do if Trump actually doubles down and says, no, absolutely, you must give up the Donbass region, even though Russia is asking for territory it hasn't been able to take in 11 years of war, which is a totally mind-boggling demand. What does Zelensky do in this situation? I think really no one even knows, perhaps not even him.
Tell us a little bit briefly, if you wouldn't mind, about the situation on the front line. I was reading yesterday that there was one soldier who just said all these diplomatic comings and goings have got nothing to do with what's actually happening in a very hot war.
Yeah, it's a very mixed picture. Very much the Ukrainian army is, a strong fighter in this war. As I just mentioned, those quotes, those kind of percentages of how much land Russia has actually been able to take. The situation on the front line is very, the Russians are constantly pushing, and actually Rubio picked up on this. He said that in the last few days, he said Ukraine has inflicted tremendous losses on the Russians. In the last month alone, they've killed 20,000 Russian soldiers in these active war activities. So the Ukraine, there's this picture painted of the Ukrainian army. The Washington Post recently came out with an article about how the Ukrainian army is very weak in terms of its Soviet structure, which is a very big contrast to the way we were talking about the Ukrainian army as being a nimble, flexible player. So it's very mixed. There's lots of media coverage of it, but really on the ground, what it is that there are these soldiers fighting to defend their country. They've developed incredibly nimble and modern ways of defending. And they just have to be given the capability to continue doing so.
Finally, Ash, let's talk a little bit about this line that came out from the US, saying that Russia's agreed to allow the US and Europe to give Ukraine robust security guarantees as part of any potential peace deal. This idea that the US would be involved in a security guarantee, that's new, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's security guarantees and there's security guarantees. To an extent, Ukraine had a security guarantee in 1994 when it gave up its nuclear weapons in return for security guarantees from Russia and the United States and the UK, and I think France was the fourth signee to the Budapest Memorandum. And within that memorandum, it said that those countries would ensure that Ukraine's borders are not forcibly altered. Well, Russia forcibly tried to alter Ukraine's borders, and those countries didn't provide full security guarantees. That's very different to something like NATO Article 5 and being a member of NATO, in which when your country is attacked, the allies will then fight back against the attacker on your behalf. So what do we hear about what are the guarantees really going to look like if Russia uses a ceasefire or a peace to simply rebuild its forces to then come back to try and finish the job, whether that's taking the territory of Kherson, Zaporizhia and Donetsk that Ukraine won't give up, or to go even further to try and attack Kiev and capture the rest of the country? Would the United States put forces on the ground to fight Russians? If we're talking even about protecting airspace, well, what would you do if Russian fighter jets incur against Ukrainian airspace? Would American fighter jets shoot down Russian fighter jets? Because that's really what we're talking about with security guarantees. Someone else is guaranteeing your security on your behalf. How far will they go? And that's really the detail of what a security guarantee looks like.
Ash Bhardwaj, journalist, academic and author, thank you so much for joining us on the line. And thanks too to Monocle's Ukrainian expert, Juliet Jen. You're with The Globalist. $14.16 in Hong Kong, which is where we head next to hear the latest now on the trial of Jimmy Lai, the Hong Kong businessman and founder of the now defunct popular newspaper, The Apple Daily. Mr. Lai, who's 77 and in frail health, faces life in prison if convicted of sedition and colluding with foreign forces. Well, I'm joined now by Adam Hancock, journalist covering Southeast Asia. He's based in Singapore and he joins me from there now. Good afternoon, Adam.
Hello, good afternoon.
Where are we up to? Because there was the trial was paused last week, wasn't it, because of Jimmy Lai's health?
Yes, that's correct. Yes. So the closing arguments of the trial were actually due to begin last Thursday. They were initially delayed because of a tropical rainstorm in Hong Kong, which meant the city kind of shut down for a day. So they were adjourned to the following day. And then there were concerns over Jimmy Lai's health, as you mentioned. He has been suffering heart palpitations in prison, according to his legal team. And therefore, it was decided that there would need to be specialist equipment that could monitor his health whilst he was in court. He's 77 now, Jimmy Lai. He's been held for over 1,600 days, and his family and his defence team have repeatedly said about how concerned they are about his health, how it's deteriorating during his time in prison. You know, a lot of that time has been spent in solitary confinement. So there have been these concerns. People who have been in court the last couple of days said that Jimmy Lai looks noticeably thinner, a lot more frail than some of his previous occurrences. So on Friday, it was decided that on medical grounds, the trial would have to be adjourned again. They came back this morning and a medical professional had declared that Mr. Lai was indeed mentally and physically fit to stand trial. And the closing arguments finally got underway, first with the prosecution. This is expected to take around about 7 or 8 days. And then there will be a period of deliberation. So we still don't have an exact date yet on exactly when this trial will come to the end. It's been going on for a long time now, but we're still waiting to find out exactly when we will get a verdict in this case.
Indeed. I mean, he was arrested, 5 years ago? So if you could just briefly recap what he's charged, he's suspected of doing, but also just how much Hong Kong has changed in the 5 years since his arrest.
Yeah. So Jimmy Lai is notorious as an outspoken critic of Beijing. He's a pro-democracy activist. He was heavily involved in the 2019 protest that you might remember in Hong Kong against Beijing. He was also responsible for editing a number of pro-democracy outlets in Hong Kong, including Apple Daily, which is now closed down. He was arrested in 2020 and arrested for the same national security laws that he had been protesting against. He's been charged with colluding with foreign forces and also a conspiracy to print and distribute seditious publications. He denies all of the charges against him. And it really shows how life has changed in Hong Kong, as you said, since 2020, since China imposed the national security law just at the start of the pandemic. At the time, they said it was needed to really stabilise Hong Kong after, it'd been shaken by those protests the previous year. But the critics of this law say it's Beijing tightening down on dissent now. It used to be quite a vibrant protest hub, if you would call it that. But nowadays in Hong Kong, you can't protest. There's all of the sites where we used to see these protests, they no longer take place. There's a lot more control over the media. There's a lot more control over politics as well. We see these elections now where only so-called patriots are allowed to stand. You can barely call them elections, in all honesty, given that Beijing is effectively deciding the candidates. So there's really no free speech in Hong Kong anymore, particularly compared to how it used to be before the national security law was implemented. We've seen a lot of pro-democracy activists either jailed or leaving the city. There was actually a story today of 2 high-profile pro-democracy campaigners being granted asylum in the UK and in Australia. So really, it's a very different city, and this particular trial with Jimmy Lai is kind of seen as a landmark moment. It's going to be a way that people can assess the national security law, how far it goes, what you can and can't do under it. And it's caught a lot of attention, particularly in the UK. He's a British citizen, Jimmy Lai, and even President Trump as well has vowed to try and save him. So there's so much attention on this case because I think it kind of summarises exactly how Hong Kong has changed in the last few years.
Adam Hancock, based in Singapore, thank you so much for bringing us up to date on the trial of Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong. Still to come on today's programme. We talk not men from Mars, but meteorites. We'll explore who owns what when objects from outer space land on our planet. Stay with us on The Globalist.
Craft is a matter of perspective, a unique outlook, an obsessive attention to detail. With UBS House View, you get the big picture in bite-sized articles, delivered daily and curated by over 200 globally connected, locally active analysts, all focused on identifying the latest investment opportunities and market risks to help you achieve your financial goals. UBS, banking is our craft.
Time for a whistle-stop tour of the papers. Let's have a conversation with Steve Crawshaw, journalist, former Human Rights Watch UK director and author of Prosecuting the Powerful, War Crimes and the Battle for Justice. Good morning, Steve.
Good morning.
Now, you have bounded into the room, again with your usually satisfying stack of folded papers. He takes really good
I'm very
notes.
old-fashioned.
He's so good.
I get very stressed looking merely at a phone. It's stressed. I know I won't be able to find the right thing at the right moment.
Yes.
I know it will be there.
We have old eyes.
It's very
we have old-fashioned eyes.
Never mind the
fine.
20th century. I'm in the 19th.
And your book is doing phenomenally well. You've just come back from Edinburgh and everyone's translating it into a million languages and it's all doing marvellously.
I'm obviously mostly unhappy as well. Of course, the reasons why people are interested is because the world is going to hell in a handbasket in so many different ways. But yeah, the themes of justice clearly matter, and I am excited that there's going to be German, there's going to be Polish, and perhaps an Arabic edition is almost confirmed. So
Brilliant.
I'm excited by that. Yeah.
Good news indeed. Right. Tell us about the news that's making the front pages in the newspapers today. We have had an extensive discussion about this astonishing European group trip to Washington that's taking place earlier on today. How are the newspapers covering it? And actually, more importantly, how are the Ukrainians covering this?
Incredible dismay, obviously, of what's going on. I think summed up in a sense by, there's a headline in the Kiev Independent, the editorial there, of saying that meeting was sickening and Putin loved it. Now, they're not alone in saying that, but obviously that's so strong coming from Ukraine. There's a good piece in the New York Times as well, which is just a reported piece from eastern Ukraine of people just in despair. They're in despair in general of what, in other words, Ukrainian held parts of eastern Ukraine, but close to the border where the Russians are, and a real sense of dismay. I hope that a robust European presence today can help protect Zelensky from the madness that we've seen before. But Trump has already been, as you guys have certainly already discussed, he's already been public with the extraordinary things he's putting on the table.
Let's talk about an excellent article in the Kiev Independent, which is actually more to do with what's happening on the front line. We've had our correspondent Julia Jen come in and talk to us about the fact that the war is grinding on.
Yeah.
regardless as to what is being said in comfortable rooms somewhere else. You wanted to draw attention to the fact that you've worked and you've done work out in Donetsk, haven't you?
Yeah.
And this is an important part of the war at the moment.
Yeah. So it is really interesting. We've seen a lot of Russia kind of encroaching back, but it's kind of remarkable that even in these circumstances, Ukraine is still managing to push back. So we'll remember that at the very beginning, it was like, oh, it's all going to be over within a few days. That wasn't. They regained lots of territory. Then there were places that I visited back in October 2023. By last year, when the book was going to print, it was like, okay, clearly these towns are going to have fallen by the time the book comes out. There was an absolute military consensus, and actually a number of those are still being held. So that Kiev Independent piece that you refer to there, the headline there is Ukraine claims battlefield success in Donetsk Oblast. And we're talking only, a village here and a village there, but they are trying so hard to defeat that narrative, which Trump is so happy to proclaim, that basically everything, the Russians are winning, it all belongs to them, and what doesn't belong to them should belong to them. And I think that sense of we need to show that we are still in this fight is really strong. But it does become very hard if you have this crazy guy in the White House who simply doesn't really care.
Let's move on to another story which we're hearing in the headlines about the police have violently broken up protests in Tel Aviv overnight. 300,000 people taking to the streets, calling for a deal with Hamas to end the war in Gaza, to protect the remaining living hostages. What's been the coverage of the protest? Because there was a national strike as well yesterday.
Yeah, so it is really interesting seeing, obviously before 7th of October and the atrocities of Hamas at that time, there were these huge protests against Netanyahu and his attempts to, if you like, bring the law under his own control. In the meantime, what we've seen growing is, especially led by the hostage families, but then with a much more national buy-in of we need a deal. And I think that fewer and fewer Israelis are buying into the narrative that we need to just continue with this until everything's destroyed. They're seeing that actually hostages are dying. So as you say, this is one of the biggest that we had, and it's interesting to see which way things will go. So Haaretz, which I always find interesting, but it is a bubble, as it always itself says within Israel. But there the headline is Israel's largest protest in over a year was a clear warning to Netanyahu. Will it matter? And I think that's a question that kind of none of us can answer, because he is very Trumpian in the sense that when everything seems to be logically against him, he just says, I don't really care and I'm doing this. And the scorn with which he or his far-right ministers respond to those protesters is quite extraordinary. So it's, if you like, having those who are suffering so much, in other words, the hostage families, those who have already know they have lost relatives or who are still alive, and yet you don't really care about them any more than Trump cares about the individual suffering at all.
Let's move on to another story about what's the Al Jazeera is covering these astonishing fires across southern Europe.
So it is astonishing, isn't it? So none of this is exactly new, and I suppose that's the depressing and the new and the important bit about it. So the headline on this particular one is the latest developments from Spain. Spain battles 20 big wildfires, deploys 500 more soldiers in the searing heat. Several people have died in Spain. It's about to get, I think, a little bit cooler, but we've seen that. We've seen obviously already in Turkey, many people died, in Greece, Montenegro and elsewhere. And so on the one hand, it's this horror, which there's so many of them that we can sometimes just kind of move on, but so big, both human and economic implications. But I'm also interested that all of these stories are often just still printed in isolation without really giving it the headline of, by the way, here's another climate crisis story, which obviously it is, and everybody sort of knows, but that's still not quite the way it's framed, which actually, if we talk about our lives and about the world, that's actually the most important thing. And it is remarkable, as British listeners may remember, it was only quite a few years ago the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Nigel Lawson, was brought on by the BBC Today programme, this most respected programme, because we needed to, quote unquote, balance the issue of whether or not climate crisis is real. That was less than 10 years ago, and I worry that we still haven't sufficiently moved. But certainly it's pretty dramatic what's happening in Spain and, of course, elsewhere as well.
Finally, a quick look at what's happening in Pompeii. Still, 25% of the town is under the ash. It is still not been excavated. And yet what you see when you go there is overwhelming. There are concerted efforts now to sort of uncover what lies beneath still. And it's the glorious, juicy life of Pompeii is being revealed in all its gorgeous, naughty glory.
It really is. Yes, the naughty glory is fairly well known, the kind of the various phalluses and gods having sex with goats and other dramatic things. So that's been there for a while. When I was in Pompeii, I have to say, probably the experience of many, the guide I had was so bad that actually I felt I really want to go back and just discover for myself.
I just left the guide.
Yeah, exactly.
And then had a very spooky experience that you find yourself wandering around Pompeii off the beaten track.
Precisely.
On your own, and it's just you and what happened.
Precisely.
And it's overwhelmingly difficult to sort of fathom. It's horrible.
You can't fathom, but you realise there's this undiscovered stuff. As you say, it is a huge amount. And the Economist piece in this week's edition, so I first came across it in the print edition, which is kind of really interesting. But actually, I realised the online one is much better because it has all of these incredible pictures, which might just as well have come out of an edition of House and Garden magazine published last month. Indeed, the piece says it's a bit like Farrow and Ball colour charts. The colours are so strong, the sense of they were here a moment ago, is very strong. And one of the reasons for that is what we sort of half know, but it's vividly described here, because of the pumice that fell on, described by one of the people involved in the excavations as like Amazon packaging material, that kind of polystyrene stuff, the stuff that's so soft, the pumice was so light that everything remains. So what they have to do is carefully pick off this very, very light stuff, some of which has been holding up the structure, so you have to do it carefully, the walls don't then fall in. But then what you get is these extraordinary views. So if it's anything like the pictures, and presumably it is, I hope in that sense the pictures don't lie, it's going to be extraordinary when we're allowed in to see that stuff.
Steve
really
Crawshaw.
Remarkable.
Thank you so much for that. Steve Crawshaw, author, journalist and formerly Human Rights Watch UK director, bringing us a paper review today on The Globalist. The time here in London is 7:32. A quick look now at some of the other stories we're following today. An apartment building in the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv has been hit in a Russian drone attack. The mayor says at least 3 people have been killed, including a 2-year-old boy. Police in Israel have violently broken up a protest outside the headquarters in Tel Aviv of the Prime Minister's Likud party. As many as 300,000 Israelis had protested to demand a deal to secure the release of the remaining hostages held by Hamas. The evening rally follows a one-day national strike across the country. A court in Australia has fined the national airline Qantas a record $59 million for illegally dismissing 1,800 ground staff during the COVID pandemic. The federal court judge said more than half the money from the fine should go to the union that brought the case. And Canada's national airline has suspended plans to resume flights. The government had ordered cabin crew not to strike over pay, but the union representing Canada's cabin staff said it was defying the government order to return to work. Hundreds of flights have been cancelled. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. 18:33 in Auckland. And now, what is going wrong in New Zealand? In the first 6 months of this year, more than 70,000 people have decided to leave for a better life abroad. More than a third of them were under 30 years old. And I'm joined now by Lisette Raymer, who's the 3 News senior correspondent based in Auckland. Good evening, Lisette.
Good evening.
So what's happened?
Good morning.
Good morning. So what's gone wrong?
Listen, it's a very good question and a hard one to answer quickly, even harder for the government, of course, who are facing a lot of questions at the moment. This isn't a new thing in terms of New Zealand's cost of living. This country has been struggling immensely ever since COVID. The government is constantly reminding everyone that it has inherited a huge COVID hangover, and it really just hasn't managed to recover. A huge part of New Zealand's economy, of course, is connected to our tourism industry. That took a huge hit. Our number one moneymaker, tourism, took a huge hit during COVID and is only really starting to improve. But I think one of the things that's really affecting New Zealand at the moment is just how appealing Australia looks in comparison. Australia is obviously dealing with its own skills shortages, and they've made themselves look incredibly appealing for Kiwis who only have 3 hours to fly across the ditch to get a job in Australia that is paid much, much better. No dramas with visas or citizenships or residency chaos. So it's a very easy trip to make and migration to make. And that's what a lot of Kiwis are looking to at the moment. So we're losing a lot of people to Australia. But the cost of living here is so extreme. I've only recently moved back from London myself, and I think obviously people know that London is an expensive place to live, but coming home I've been absolutely shocked at just how expensive it is to live in New Zealand. It's comparable to London. We've got huge issues when it comes to our food and the cost of supermarket shopping, for example. There's headline news every week of something costing an exorbitant amount. For example, at the moment, everyone's up in arms over a block of butter costing around $10, so £5 for a block of butter, which is, a Kiwi classic, a staple in everyone's pantry. But that's the sort of thing that now is becoming unaffordable for a lot of families and is pushing people to look across the world and see where else they could live and have a better life.
So what can be done here, given the fact that what you have just described seems like an impossible situation for New Zealand?
Yeah, it is really, really hard, and it has been. I mean, our Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon, this is his first term, and he sounds like a broken record at the moment, saying that his priority is the economy, getting the economy up and running again, boosting the economy, probably to a fault. People are almost sick of hearing him talk about that, but it really has been his number one thing. A big part of what the government is doing is boosting infrastructure projects. So injecting the local economy, creating jobs for people, because our unemployment rates are also skyrocketing. I think they're at a near 5-year high. So they want to get people into work. They want to stimulate the economy with big projects. And so they've pushed accelerate on a bunch of government infrastructure projects like roading, for example. So that's a massive priority for them at the moment, and they've really accelerated that. But yeah, it's a really, really tough one. And at the moment, while the government is trying to work it out, Kiwis are trying to work it out. And the solution for a lot of people, more people than there has been in a very long time, is to go abroad and have a much more affordable, not just life in terms of costs, but also in terms of potential earnings. The jobs in New Zealand do not pay enough to sustain, just your weekly supermarket shop and your accommodation. It's tough for people.
Have you noticed, since you've come back to New Zealand, an absence of people and indeed a change that must be having on the country's economy?
I think you notice a lot of mostly the thing that stood out for me is the number of people who are going to Australia. For years, New Zealanders, especially those under 30, have gone on their OE, we call it, the overseas experience in London, and gone and had that amazing 2-year or 3-year now experience on the other side of the world. That has always been a kind of rite of passage for Kiwis. But now this idea of, I'm seeing so many graduates coming out of university and talking about, I'll do a couple years here, but the goal is to end up in Australia, because they know that's where the money and the opportunity is and where they can really build a future. And that's what's shocking, is hearing young people not talk about just going on a 3-year whirlwind adventure in Europe and doing a bunch of kontikis and making friends and memories. You're talking to people and they're talking about, here's my get out route of the country, which is very, very different to anything I've experienced. And definitely you walk down streets and you notice that a lot of the shops are closing, a lot of really popular shopping streets, there's shops that are available for rent. That is something we're seeing a lot more of, and I've certainly noticed is different. But there's a huge, I guess, priority and focus being put on that by the government, because we do have so much that needs doing here and so many skills that are required that we don't have. So there's a huge emphasis also on encouraging people from overseas to move to New Zealand, really building making those visas more available to international visitors to get that talent into the country and inject that stimulus into the economy.
Lisette Raymer, 3 News senior correspondent based in Auckland. Thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio.
there's a craft to every question, which is why at UBS, we query every aspect of the market, working with specialized experts and award-winning research teams, covering over 3,500 stocks in 50 countries, all delivered in a comprehensive library, answering what you want with what you need. UBS, banking is our craft.
Now for some more economics news, I'm joined by Vicky Price, economist and former joint head of the UK government's economic service. Good morning, Vicky.
Good morning.
How's your August going?
Well, I mean, suddenly we've got clouds and rain, so I'm disappearing to Greece tomorrow.
Excellent, good idea. Right, before you go, bring us up to date with what's happening in economics.
Well, it's interesting because, of course, we're having the meeting in Washington with all the EU leaders, sort of a number of them anyway, going for the summits, and also with the Ukraine president and President Trump. So the markets, you would have thought, would be worried. But in fact, what they're focusing on seems to be the forthcoming meeting of central bank governors and heads of central banks, which is happening later this week, which is an annual event in the States. And that is meant to more or less sort of encourage everyone to think that there will be some sort of softening in what Jay Powell says, the head of the Fed, about looking forward to where interest rates may go. So the expectation is that rates perhaps will be cut in September. So the expectation of the markets is that now there's an 85% chance of that happening. The result of that is that markets, I looked them up for overnight trends in Asia, have been going up. They've been going up actually for the last few days anyway, and in some cases at record high levels, because they're expecting a softening and therefore faster growth in the economy. So they seem to have put tariffs and everything else the back, of the sort of list of things that they're worried about, rather than at the front, as has been the case until recently.
And how unusual is this? Because tariffs have actually dominated pretty much everything for the last 6 months.
I think what's been going on is that there was so much worry about it all, and there was a lot of uncertainty. And where we're heading towards is a bit more certainty, even though the tariffs are very high for some countries. I mean, look at Switzerland, for example, 39%, which they did not quite expect. But loads of other countries too have ended up with quite high tariffs, but they were lower than they had anticipated earlier, so just a few months ago. So in some Southeast Asian countries, since I looked at Asia, where the expectation was of a 36% tariff, now it's 19%. That seems to be better. And the markets have decided that we're just going to have to live with this, even though, of course, there could be more changes. There are issues such as what's going to happen to the pharmaceutical sector, what's going to happen to semiconductors. A lot of concerns, of course. You've seen what's going on with pricing of particular products in Europe, which people are following, or companies are following what President Trump is telling them, raise prices there so you can lower them a little bit in the US. So there is a lot of concern about this, and the tariffs that may be imposed on pharmaceuticals more generally and semiconductors are worrying the markets. And the EU, if you look at them, they still haven't quite signed the joint declaration, the joint framework of tariff agreements that have been made some time ago, because there are still discussions about services in the background. So there is still uncertainty there. But nevertheless, other things seem to have become now a little bit more prominent. But we may get back to that again pretty soon.
There is an interesting article, I think it's in the Times, isn't it, that we're talking about tariffs, and we're talking about the fears and how much people are worried about it. But the practicalities don't seem to have kicked in yet, that actually collecting tariffs doesn't seem to have been set in an organised manner.
Well, that's not very surprising, because, of course, what is happening is, just as I explained, I touched on a little a few minutes ago, is that there are different tariffs for different countries, for different products, and those are changing. So imagine being, at the other end when you are trying to sort of calculate, as the Customs and Border Protection Agency is trying to do in the US, what you're going to be charging and how you're going to be ensuring that those tariffs are collected as well. So implementation seems to be an issue. So although the effective tariff rate should be around 18 to 19%, if you're looking at all the negotiations that have taken place, if you look across the spectrum of countries where tariffs have been imposed by the US, in reality, I think it's only around 10% at present. that is being charged and therefore collected. So it's a bit less than had been anticipated. But nevertheless, if you look at how much the US has collected so far, it's around 150 billion from the extra tariffs that have been imposed just recently. The target had been around 300 billion is what we expected to happen in a year. So they're not too far off. But nevertheless, what is going on right now is that the fact that there are such differences and so many uncertainties as well, the task of implementing it properly is enormous. And, there's no, huge complaint about how they're operating it, but it is really the complexity of it all that has led to that, and probably will be going up in the next few months as a percentage of what they collect.
Finally, we've got less than a minute, I'm afraid, Vicky, to talk about the trade deal between the US and the UK. The sort of the consequences are being felt already.
Yes, and I think we're going to see that in other countries as well. So the fact that we have agreed with the US that we're going to be bringing in a lot of ethanol at no tariff at all, about huge quantities, which actually are more or less what the UK needs. Now tariff-free instead of the 19% that was a tariff that was imposed before, means that basically our bioethanol production here sort of is coming to an end, and the main bioethanol plant we have is announcing is closing down because the UK government is not supporting it. So I'm afraid there are repercussions of those deals, which some people are saying perhaps had not been thought about, unintended consequences, or maybe intended, who knows.
Vicky Price, economist, former joint head of the UK government's economic service, and woman off to Greece tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining us on the line on Monocle Radio. Now, you would think that in somewhere like the United Arab Emirates that there'd be plenty of places to park your car. After all, it is a place where car is king. But people are increasingly finding it difficult to find a spot. And it's opening up a wider debate about how this part of the world organises itself when it comes to transport. Well, Inzamam Rashid is Monocle's Gulf correspondent on the line from Dubai. Good morning, Inzamam. How's Dubai looking?
Good morning. Actually, in Istanbul this morning, well, just outside of Istanbul, in Göcek, I'm just here on a bit of a retreat. So not entirely sure what's going on in Dubai right now, but I can tell you a bit about parking if you'd like, Emma.
I'm absolutely delighted to, and thank you for emerging from your retreat to talk to us. We are immensely grateful for that. Okay, what's gone wrong with the parking? Not where you are, but somewhere else.
Well, yeah, it's pretty bad in Istanbul as well, I think. But look, so there's these Göcek parking lots is what they're called. And they're these kind of very sandy parking lots that were all over Dubai, probably way before Dubai had built up the way it had done. And they were great free parking options for many people, especially if you were heading down to Business Bay to go to work, or around the kind of marina area, if you were popping into the shops. A lot of these kind of sandy parking lots available. Just pop your car there and go in. But now a lot of these are disappearing, and areas have really shifted to paid parking zones, and that's caused a bit of a nightmare for a lot of people, because some of the parking prices can be pretty extortionate, and from my experience, not that well clearly labelled either. We're talking about this probably because I got a parking ticket myself the other day, which was a bit of a shame, and it costs about 170 dirhams, which is just over 30 quid for a parking ticket, which isn't too bad, but they are very frustrating because they come quite common, because it's not that clear if you park your car near an office that you will have to pay for the parking.
Is this just an inevitable part or an inevitable story of a city monetising its parking spots? I mean, to all intents and purposes, absolutely everybody else has been doing this for years. So one would actually ask, why has this taken Dubai so long?
Yeah, I think that's quite interesting, because I think Dubai probably would like to kind of see itself as this country where, okay, everyone's welcome on the roads and come park up and you can pop inside wherever you want to. Obviously, valet parking is a huge thing here. Still, you go to a lot of the kind of high-end luxury venues, and valet parking still is very much a thing, and it's often free as long as you get your ticket stamped on the way out. Not many people do that. I've forgotten to do that many times and had to run back to the beach club, get the stamp on the ticket, and then give it to the valet team. But what they are doing, and I think quite cleverly, whilst all these paid parking areas are now increasing across the UAE, they have included free parking for worshippers if you're going to the mosque, and there's parking lots around the mosque that can be free during prayer times. Residential and public spaces, however, there's multi-story kind of public parking facilities which charge around £1 per hour, or around £8 a day, and they operate around the clock. But what I found incredibly interesting is you go to some of these vast malls like the Dubai Mall, and only this year did they implement parking charges. If you want to park your car at Dubai Mall, I think you get the first hour or two for free. But if you're spending a lot more than that, doing your shopping and Fashion Avenue, all that kind of stuff, you could be paying a lot of money for parking. And automatically, it comes out of your account for the toll fee that you're constantly paying on the road, which also isn't cheap at all.
Is this a symptom of the fact that the UAE just hasn't got its public transport system in order, or are people just too wedded to their cars?
It's incredibly busy. To be honest, during the summer, it's been quite nice actually, because it has been a lot quieter. But people are just glued to their cars here, and there's two elements of it. There's a sense of showing off the flashy car that you're driving up and down the Sheikh Zayed Road and to all the beach clubs and the restaurants in the evening. There is, of course, that element. But obviously, the public transport isn't as well connected as it should be. And that's something that the UAE is doing to change. They are bringing in Etihad Rail, which will link all the Emirates and can get you to Oman as well. Right now, if you wanted to go between Dubai and Abu Dhabi, there is no public transport other than a bus that you can catch, which isn't that frequent, and you have to go to specific terminals to get it. Most people are driving up and down in their cars. Etihad Rail will fix that problem. I just feel the UAE has got itself in a position where people are so used to having their cars. So it's such an important part of their life. They're so ingrained with driving that the shift to public transport might take a pretty big, a lot of time, and it would have to take a big kind of shift in mindset to get people using it.
Inzamam Rashid, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Istanbul. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Finally, who owns the stars, or indeed the planets and the bits that land on us? Last month, the 25-kilo meteorite from Mars, no less, was sold at auction in New York for $5 million. The object was discovered 2 years ago, not in New York, but in Niger, by a professional meteorite hunter. Well, how it came to pop up at auction is the subject of some mystery and debate. And to tell us more, I'm joined in the studio by Tira Schubert, Fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society and Ambassador for the Science Museum. A pleasure to have you join us. Thank you so much, Tira.
Well, it's lovely to be here.
You haven't just brought you in, have you?
I have a little bit of space for you to touch and see. A bit of the early solar system is right in front of you right now.
Which is astonishing. This is radio, though, so this isn't easy. Can you bring us... So it looks like a beautiful but jet black pebble that you brought in.
It's about the same size as a cashew nut. And if you pick it up, you'll find it's
Can I pick it up?
Please pick it up.
Thank you so much.
It's much heavier than you would imagine it to be, because it's 95% iron and about 5% nickel, a bit of cobalt and phosphorus and sulfur thrown in there.
Where's it from?
And it's from Siberia. It came from a famous meteorite fall in 1947, and we know about it because it crashed down 23 tons of material, which is big. It was in the middle of Siberia, though, in 1947.
Good job, really, 23 tons. Where had it fallen
it
from?
Had fallen. It wasn't from Mars, and it made a smoke tail of 23 kilometers, and the sound of the impact was heard 300 kilometers away. And a local artist, I've given you a stamp that was issued in the Soviet Union in commemoration. A local artist, Mr. P.J. Medvedov, was at his window seeing it come down. So he drew a painting of it, a long tail of smoke coming from the heavens. But But we often don't see meteorites. They fall on the Earth. Several tons a day fall on the Earth. And that means thousands of tons a year fall on the Earth. They're usually from the asteroid belt.
How often does 25 kilos in one piece land on the Earth? Because that's what's happened in Niger.
Niger is, that's not very often do we find them, because 7/10 of Earth is oceans, and most of them fall into the ocean. And this is even more unusual because it's so big, because usually the mass burns up and you have 10 tiny little pebbles like the one that we have in front of us, the size of a peanut. But this came from Mars, and there's only about 400 meteorites we know that came from Mars on Earth. So a big asteroid in the asteroid belt came bouncing around and hit Mars, and a chunk of Mars then was knocked off and then launched into space and eventually landed on Earth.
And then it landed in a New York auction house, which is where all the big problems of what you have compared, what you've just described there, is comparatively simple to what's actually happening with the arguments about who owns that thing, who's allowed to sell it, who's allowed to buy it.
Well, this is very unknown territory in most places. And let's give it its proper name, its romantic name of NW16788. Well, NW, I think we can call it that because we seem familiar with it, somehow appeared in Italy first. The Italian Space Agency had it on display, and the government in Niger was aware of it. But I think it was the price tag of over $5 million in Sotheby's that got their attention, because other countries that have meteorites easy to find, I'm talking about countries with deserts, meteorite hunters go to Morocco, they go to Oman, they go to places in the Sahara, because you have that black rock that we've looked at here against the white sand, and you buy a permit from the Geological Survey of the country, and then you tell them, I found this. You don't have to do that when you go to Antarctica, which is an even better place to find meteorites. But Niger doesn't have a system like that, and they're very cross about that. So they've started an investigation.
They want it back, don't they?
I think not necessarily. They might want it back, or they might want a share of the money. But it is a valuable thing, and we have actually sent one back to Mars. We've sent a chunk of a Mars meteorite from London back to Mars. The Natural History Museum has about 20 of them, and it's sent it back on the Perseverance mission in 2020 to use a calibration point for some of the geological experiments on that mission.
Does that remove the element of human greed, which seems to be slightly dominant in this story?
Well, human greed, I don't think ever can be removed. And there is a hot market in meteorites out there. So if you want to, if you're tired of investing in Picassos and Jackson Pollocks, you can invest in some meteorites. Some of them costs are hefty prices, 5 figures.
And the fact is that we've only got a few seconds, but the fact is that different places have different laws determining what to do with these things when they land, don't they?
Yes, but I think that there's going to be a lot more countries looking at meteorite laws. So all you space lawyers out there, keep your eyes open.
For the space lawyer listeners of Monocle Radio, Tira Schubert, thank you so much for coming in. Fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society, Ambassador for the Science Museum, and bearer of meteorites into the studio. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to the producers, Chris Chermack, Tom Webb and Monica Lillis. Our researcher was Henry King. Our studio manager was Mariella Bevan. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The briefing's live at midday here in London. The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. Tira's just put the meteorite in her top pocket, by the way, everybody, carrying it like as you would a pair of glasses. It's quite astonishing. Anyway, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening and have a great week.